Welcome to a special edition of the 6Ps podcast. We're joined by some extremely special guests. In fact, it's a privilege to be in the company of these three exceptional human beings. I'm joined by Assessor X, Assessor Y, and Jim Lord. Welcome to all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Anytime. So we've actually spoken with you previously, so it's really great to have your company once again. We've had a lot of positive feedback about our previous podcasts and videos. So today is all about Section C of the exam, or the Analysing Argument SAC, as we look at ways that we can improve. And we've been asked a few questions by our listeners out there who wanted some advice on how to go about this particular essay type. And we've got about 8 or 9 questions to ask. And the first one from our listener asks, what distinguishes a B essay from an A or an A plus essay? And I might go to Assessor X to answer that question for us first.
All right, thank you very much. Obviously, if you've got an essay at a B standard, it's going to be pretty solid. It's going to be doing all of the things that we'll be looking for. What we would look for to move beyond that, though, is fluency and expression. The better that is, the higher up in grades you're going to go. We'd also be looking for a little bit of subtlety in the way that you analyze a language and in the way that you approach the analysis of the argument too. So little things like perhaps looking at the structure of the text that you're given, how the argument develops, the order that the points are put in by the writer, and being able to pick that apart and weave that into your analysis. Don't neglect the visuals either. Make sure you've got plenty on those, and the way that you link them to the argument used by the writer, that's really important as well. But yeah, just to emphasize the main point, expression. Definitely look at your vocab, look at your verbs, make sure you're accurate as well.
Beautiful. Thanks for that. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Jim Lord or Assessor Y?
I'm happy to add to that a little bit. I think the previous assessor there was exactly right in terms of that expression. One of the things that we talk about a lot is being precise and being concise. So getting to your point and being succinct, while at the same time you're using very precise vocabulary. So don't start just playing with a thesaurus and trying for fancy words if they're not precisely related to what you're trying to say. And I think particularly for analyzing arguments where we're talking about analyzing someone else's language, it's quite useful for that precision to be a focus.
Yeah, and I might add as well, after those really, really comprehensive points, I think I really like, I know we all do, I really like when students find the subtlety in tonal shifts. I think finding arguments is obviously a priority and something that you sort of pin your entire essay upon. But those subtleties in tonal shifts, not only do they provide a really nice opportunity to delve into subtext and inference, but if done well, I think that could be the difference between something that is superficial is not the word I want to use, but something that I guess with those tonal inclusions can add a little bit more complexity to an essay that's at a B standard, I think.
Yeah, that's great advice, Jim, and I agree with all the feedback that's been given there. That's really good advice. I might stick with you, Jim Lord, if I could, for the next question. And we've been asked, how should we organise our timing in terms of writing and to be able to finish on time? How much do you recommend on each part? I assume they mean each sort of paragraph in their exam. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so obviously we get questions all the time in regards to how many paragraphs should I write, when should I have a page break, things like that. So to answer that question definitively obviously depends on how many paragraphs you're going to include. And that can vary between sort of 4 to 5 body paragraphs at times, obviously depending on the length and what are of the articles and what arguments you find within them. I know someone's going to speak later about do you have to hit every argument and things like that? So it is really worthwhile listening to that in regards to this question also. Generally, though, I think it's really, really important that you try to make sure that you have annotated your articles really in no more than 10 minutes. I think that's a really, really good target. I think introductions, which is something that you can practice and you can really get used to. It doesn't matter that you're going to get a random article you've never seen before. It's that formula of IDAC fast. It's really, really important. And when you've done it a few times, you can absolutely achieve that in a couple of minutes. You're really trying to get as many elements within those one or two sentences in your intro as possible. Obviously, fluency and expression are key, but making sure that you include those. So with those two things combined, you're looking, before you start writing, you're looking at somewhere around that 12-minute mark that you've already used up, which obviously then leaves you about 48 minutes to write. I really think that's an excellent target. If you find yourself annotating for longer than that, I strongly suggest that you just get going, that you just start getting your pen to paper. If you can pump out those couple of first arguments well, and you are struggling for time, you can then revisit that second article quickly. But I would be making sure that, as we always advise in that 10-minute reading time, that you are absolutely immersed in that article as much as possible. You need to come out of that 10-minute reading time knowing not only your issue, your contention, your tone, all those sort of things, but you need to have a really good understanding about where your arguments are so that your annotation is specific and direct. Little techniques like remembering which paragraphs your arguments might exist in, so that you will just say that number to yourself over and over again. So it might be paragraph 1, 4, 6, 7, 10, 1, 4, 6, 7, 10, 1, 4. You just keep saying it, just making sure that you can quickly get yourself to that annotation. And I think that, coupled with your 10 minutes of actual annotating time, should provide an opportunity to leave yourself with 45 to 48 minutes of writing time. That's the kind of guidance I give my class, and I'm hoping I'm not too dissimilar to the advice that's been flying around in other classes. But I think in regards to how long per paragraph, I guess you can do the maths there, on depending on how many paragraphs you've got with that 45 minutes left.
Yeah, that's correct. And again, it's interesting that the article itself, or the articles itself, will make a really big difference in terms of how you break up that timing. And this is why practicing is really important for this particular unit of work, because you do want to be able to cut down your writing time as much as possible, and not get to the end and realize that you've missed out on mentioning certain parts of the text. It actually leads us in nicely to the next question, and I'll go to Assessor X on this one. And this is predominantly for the exam, where you've got 15 minutes of reading time, and most of that will be taken up on section C, on the Analysing Arguments section. So Assessor X, if we could ask you what the best form of using your reading time would be.
Oh, right. I was thinking about the SAC, so we'll come back to that. But yeah, for the exam, I'd definitely suggest you spend a couple of minutes just looking at your Section A topics. You should obviously know before you go in whether you want to do Rear Window or the Golden Age. Most people do a Rear Window. Occasionally, people like to do the Golden Age. Have a look, have a read, choose which one you'd like to do. Already, there'll be part of your mind starting to plan that. Just push that to the back. Head to Section B, same thing. Which comparative topic do you like the look of? Again, set part of your mind off, having a little think about that. And you definitely want to spend the bulk of your time on Section C. And this is where there's a bit of crossover now with what you can do with the 10 minutes reading time for the SAC. You first read through, don't try and think about picking it apart or the different elements of the text. Read the whole thing, consider it as a whole text. Really try and get your head around what the contention is, because if you get that wrong, or you're not quite right, or you don't think about it in enough detail, you will lose marks. So it is worth just considering that, and also consider the tone as well while you're doing that. Once you've had that read through and have a think about is a whole text, particularly for the SAC, because you don't know what combination of text you will get. We will give you 2 or 3, you know, there'll be a visual element, but you don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So have a think, use your common sense. With the structure that we've been teaching, think about which version of that, or how you would need to adapt that to make it work. For example, one of the main differences is if the visual text is a separate text or if it's integrated into one of the written ones. Once you've got that all kind of worked out in your mind, then definitely, and I agree with what the last speaker was saying, that you want to be coming out of your reading time knowing which sections to focus on, because you don't want to waste time annotating sections that you won't write about. What I say to my classes is start with the obvious. You will at least have one visual and you need to link it to some part of the written text, whether it's a separate visual or an integrated visual. So I'd always find that link first. Once you've got an argument to kind of latch it onto, you know then that will be included. So that's kind of your first part to make sure you annotate. Other things, I would do a quick little kind of comparison in your head, save some stuff from whatever the main text is for your comparative paragraph or section. That is only for the SAC, obviously, because we do not compare in the exam. And then when you're faced with your main text, which should be obvious, it will be longer. I always like to think of something from the beginning, something from the middle, something from the end. There will always be something good at the start, whether they are outrightly stating their contention, whether they're telling you a nice little story to get you interested, or some of the strategy, but there will be something there that you can write about. And then as soon as you can get your pen, that's it. Highlight away just on those key little sections.
Beautiful. That's great advice. I might go to Assessor Y now. Just any tips or tricks about using your time wisely for analysing argument?
I think I would agree with everything that's already been said, and really make sure that your annotations are useful for you and for you only. There's no point in writing detailed notes as soon as you've got your pen. No one's going to read it ever. So sure that you're getting notes that you can use as you're writing. So whether that's just writing a question mark beside rhetorical questions you want to focus on, or just even circling things on the visual that you yourself will remember what that means, I think that's really useful, as opposed to starting to do a thorough annotation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great advice there. We're going to go back to Jim Lord again. And this question is about comparison. So this is specific to the SAC in itself. And this listener asks us, how do you compare the two texts and when should it be done?
Okay. So those of people in my class, I guess, that are listening, if you work out my identity, those of you in my class, I'm trialing something a little bit different, but I might just park that for now because I don't want to confuse things. So what I'll do is I'll talk about, and what I'm about to go into is what we've all done for many, many years, and it's absolutely a successful way. I'm just giving another option out there as well, which other people might take up as well. Look, in regards to comparison, stay with me here, but I use a little bit of a strange, analogy or metaphor, if you like. So the way I like to look at it is, if you've got the two articles, I like to look at it like a video game. And that's the way that I teach my class. Your main article is level 1 and your second article is level 2. Now, you can't go straight to level 2 because you need to complete level 1 first. And at the same time, you can't be playing level 1 and then duck over to level 2 for a little bit, then come back to level 1. Can't do it. You've got to do them in order. So article 1 or level 1, you must play that out first. So level 2 just doesn't exist. You know it's coming up, but it doesn't exist in your analysis for now. So what I want you to do is I want you to ring or fill through your response with as much of that quality analysis from the article 1 that you can. Get that all the way out. Play it all the way out. When you've done that, you've unlocked level 2. And that's when you can begin to access that second level or that second article. Now, you are going to play the game exactly the same way. You are going to take on the challenge of level 2 or article 2 in exactly the same fashion. But the thing is that you've learned a few things from playing level 1. There's a few things that happened in level 1 or article 1 that remind you of how to achieve level 2. So when you're in that second article, I want you to do exactly the same thing. Attack it in exactly the same way. You're focusing on your argument, looking through the way that the language is delivered, the effect on the audience, exactly the same way. But there's the added element. When you notice something in article 2 or level 2 that relates to something that you achieved in article 1 or article 2, or something that you analysed, acknowledge it. Make note of it, deliver it, analyse it, and then talk about how that is delivered in a different way or a similar way, and potentially how that may affect the audience in a different or similar way. Okay, so nothing should change. You're doing the same thing. You've just got that added knowledge now when you're playing level 2 or you're in article 2, because you've just written on something. Now, not everything will connect the same way that when you're playing level 2, there are going to be new experiences in that level. There are going to be new things, new challenges that you have to undertake. And some of them may have nothing to do with elements of level 1 or article 1. But if there are, make sure you acknowledge it. All right, now level 2 is quicker, it's shorter. Article 2 usually is quicker and shorter. So there won't always be consistent comparison or contrast. But when there is, make sure you acknowledge it, talk about the similarities or differences, and then by extension, the effect on the audience. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great advice. And I think it goes to show as well that, you know, there's no one way to go about this. But what's important is, as Jim Lord just mentioned then, is that you are hitting those really important pieces of information and doing it in a clear way and a fluent way. And that makes complete sense. You work through the first text, and when you're going through the second text, anytime you need to go back, that's exactly what you do. Our assessors, Assessor X or Assessor Y, it's a tongue twister. Any comments from you about the comparative section of this SAC?
Not hugely. I think that Jim Lord really covered that very effectively. And I like the analogy that was happening there. So just 100%. Endorsing that 100%.
Thanks, friend.
Beautiful. I might say I love the video game thing. It's going into the repertoire, I think. Sold. Once you get through cups and cubes, then once you get through cups, you can do cubes and so forth. Yeah,
after absolutely. Yeah, in order. Correct. Absolutely. Yes.
All right. Assessor Y, question directed at you now. And it asks, my teacher asks me to avoid generic analysis. How do I do this? Assessor Y, what are your thoughts about generic analysis and how to avoid it?
So, to me, generic analysis can take two main forms, and one is definitional in terms of people getting a bit nervous and falling back to a rhetorical question is a question in which that kind of thing, where they're giving you a definition of a particular technique. The other one is a little bit better than the definitional generic analysis, but it's still quite generic in terms of saying, here's a rhetorical question, and it's making the reader think about this question. So at least in the second example, they're engaging somewhat with the text, but it's still on a very surface level. And I think to become a bit more nuanced is what we're after. So thinking about what exactly is this rhetorical question doing, or exactly is this particular statistic doing? I find this often happens with statistics where people, because they're numbers, you can find them generally quite quickly when you're looking and you're stressed, but you need to think about the impact of them. So if we're getting a statistic about how many people have done X, Y, or Z, think about why that might be. So rather than saying 75% of people have been positioned to think this way, think about how does that connect to the central argument? How does that connect to the argument that the author is positing at the moment? and what might that impact be on the intended audience specifically. So the more precise you can get, particularly with the audience as well. So thinking about, are they an Australian audience? Well, they are going to be in this SAC. Are they a Victorian audience? Are they a Queensland audience? Are they from Malvern? Or are they from Footscray? It's going to make a difference. So think about that intended audience and how that particular device in this instance is going to be positioning them to agree with this particular argument. So really avoid that definitional and avoid the generic.
Yeah, for sure. And it leads into the next question, where they ask, are persuasive devices important, and why should you not always state what they are? I might take this question, and I think for me, persuasive devices are a good place to start. They do provide you with a bit of guidance in terms of what you should be annotating and what you can look to analyze. But they're not everything. And if we focus simply on the persuasive devices, as Assessor Y says, we can sort of fall into the trap of analyzing what the persuasive device does rather than what the quotation does. And we really need to be careful about not always labeling them as well, or even overusing phrases. So if there are statistics, you don't want to continually say that they're statistics, or if they're rhetorical questions, not always referring to them as rhetorical questions. It's really important for your expression that you change that up. And whether you use phrases like, this evidence or this plea or this demand or this appeal, whatever it is, rather than specifically mentioning the device, you'll find it will allow your expression and vocabulary to be a little bit more complex, a little bit more sophisticated. They're definitely a good place to start, but they should not be the bulk of your analysis. Persuasive devices, as I said, are there to sort of guide you rather than to, I guess, force you into analysing specific things. Anyone else have a comment on persuasive devices or on generic analysis?
I could add something on the devices. I always like to look for just anything to do with language. It is language analysis that they want to see how that supports the argument. So look for other things. Look for stuff like short sentences that stand out. Anything in inverted commas is always worth looking at.
Capital letters?
Just
capital letters?
Definitely capitals, bold, and some of that can cross over with the visuals. There was an exam, I think it was years ago now, where there was a title that was all in the shape of different animals because it was about what the speech was about, some environmental kind of idea. And a lot of people ignored it, which, was silly. So yeah, bold, capitals, just if word choice, you can do lots on vocabulary. So don't forget about language that isn't necessarily a persuasive device.
I'm going to comment on the visual language that the other assessor brought up, because some people did some really good stuff with the 2020 exam. It was a very simple visual, but by digging into it slightly and looking at what one of the people was wearing and therefore thinking they were from the city in a country locale and connecting that to what was going on in the actual text, they got some really nuanced and elegant responses out of it, whereas some people who ignored some of the elements of the visual and just went, it's a photograph, there's a drone and some lady, didn't obviously achieve that nuanced investigation. So use some of your media skills that you've picked up in other classes and definitely with Rear Window, and you can apply them here as well.
I was just going to add to the persuasive devices or techniques as well. I really strongly agree with what Jim Session was saying in regards to I guess, not feeling like they're an essential element that you must always label. Obviously, any labeling of any form is going to cost you fluency and your stylistic kind of grade. But there is a way that you can sort of subtly embed those a little bit. So you kind of you maintain your fluency, but you also do get a couple of ticks here or there for that meta language, and that's just making sure. I'm sure there's a more sort of formal name for this, or a more official name for this, but I like to call it active verb. So instead of saying something like the author uses rhetorical question to blah, 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 Victorian government, you could say something like the author rhetorically questions the Victorian government or the issue from the Victorian government. So embedding it in that active way, like when you're analysing it as if the author's doing it or the writer is doing it, they're in front of you, as opposed to saying they use this, mention them doing it. Instead of the author uses rhetorical question, the author rhetorically questions. So you maintain that fluency. You can go off on your argument analysis, but you don't have to pause and label something, if that makes sense.
We might have sort of answered this question, but there might be still a little bit more. So, Assessor Y, the next question for you: what if we can't label a quotation with a persuasive device? What do we do?
You can still address it, and I think we've kind of covered that there. Definitely talk about what it's doing, how it's doing it, show us where it's happening, all that good stuff. If you don't have the meta language for a particular device, that's totally fine. We do want to see meta language, obviously, at times throughout your essay to show that you've got command of it. But if you're not sure what something is, or if something is many things all at once and you can't think of all the titles for it, don't worry about it. Just get to the actual analysis part. And I think for our students, there's a great activity in that booklet about writing, analyzing arguments, essays, where you've got 7 different sentence structures to work through this. And I really encourage students to do that and look at the different ways you can write about these techniques.
Yeah, and if something's quote worthy, it's quote worthy. Like, analyze it.
100%. Don't leave it out. And certainly don't ignore an entire argument just because you don't know what techniques are underpinning it. You can still dig into it and do some really lovely stuff with it.
That leads on to the next question. Do I need to mention every argument? Well, given that there is a set amount of time to write this, look, there's 2 angles to take with this. You can either look to maybe combine some arguments together, or you can look to really focus what Assessor X says and looking at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And as long as you're mentioning things like tonal shift and audience shift, especially when it comes to the arguments, if they begin in a really sympathetic and heartfelt tone and then become more aggressive and more attacking, you want to make sure that you hit that. Like the first article we looked at with the Jaguaran trees, there was that really emotive beginning with the imagery throughout. And that was really targeting those progressive readers who value things like justice and equality and Indigenous rights. And then in the second part of the text, the focus was on the Victorian government and really attacking their values and their position as being this really progressive government and not demonstrating those progressive values in this particular issue. And for me, what's really important is those really massive big ticket items, those tonal shifts, especially when it comes to the arguments themselves, and then the audience shifts are going to be really, really important. But if you were to go through an annotated article and take half an hour to annotate it, there is no possible way you could possibly analyze everything you've annotated. So it's really important that you are considered and selective in what you choose to analyze. Does anyone else have something to add to that?
Yeah, I can a little bit. I would say if you were to analyze everything in a text, you'd probably end up with a 10-page essay. So you can't do it. Also want to be aware of wandering into the realms of summary. It's something that VCAR particularly look out for, even in, and I think Assessor Y will agree with me, with even in essays that are analytical and have some very good passages of analysis, what they look out for and they absolutely hate are topic sentences with words like states, discusses, talks about. It just screams summary to them. So really keep an eye on that. And again, go back to that fabulous writing guide booklet and use the verbs that are in there. Something like argues or asserts or a synonym of that.
Advocates.
Probably sidesteps the point a little bit, but just thought it was worth mentioning.
100%. And I think in addition to one of the points that keeps coming up when assessors are talking is that there's no, correct essay that we're looking for. There's no template that we all sit down and say, well, this is exactly how you divide up the text, and if you're not dividing it up this way, then you're wrong. That's not the case. What we're looking for is your take on it. Now, that's not to say you can run off into the woods with it, but that we do understand that there's not a template you're aiming for is the key idea there.
And that leads us to our last question. And that is, seeing as we don't see the article until the SAC or the exam, what's the best way to study for this? And this is a very good question, and one that we get asked a lot. And for me, it's pretty simple. You just need to write as much as possible. You need to look at as many different types of texts as well. We knew leading up into the exam last year that they hadn't had a speech in a while, and lo and behold, there was a speech in the actual exam. And sometimes we can neglect speeches because we're always looking at articles from newspapers and websites and stuff. So making sure you're looking at not just opinion pieces and letters to the editor, but editorials, speeches, even blogs. I'm expecting them 1 year to bring a blog in from somewhere. And also notice the different audiences too. So we know previously in VCAR exams that sometimes they have been a specific profession, be it biodiversity and scientists. Sometimes they've been local communities. And sometimes we even had cafe reviews. It could be really anything on the exam. So my advice is to search wide and far, look at a range of different articles, which thankfully we have in our pack that we handed out to you, and you'll be able to see there, and to write as much as possible. And your teachers are your number one resource. So their feedback really is invaluable. They're your number one resource. They're your number one supporter as well. They want you to go really, really well. So my advice is, in summary, look at as many different texts as possible, write as much as you can, and gain any feedback. I might get some last words from all of you, and I might start with Jim Lord. Any last words or any bits of advice you'd like to hand out?
Yeah, I'll just to reiterate all the wonderful bits of feedback and really to endorse and reiterate the comments about leaning on your teacher. We, as teachers, we all try to make class interesting. We all try to engage you in different ways with different contexts and different entry points into a lesson, into learning. But at the end of the day, this study design is set up to write. If you're not writing, it doesn't matter how amazing you are in discussion. It doesn't matter how many flashcards you can remember. It doesn't matter how well you went in the class debate. If you're not writing, you're going to do yourself a disservice. So that would be my last bit of advice. Just please, just draft. It doesn't have to be a full essay. Get a few paragraphs through. Just get used to that writing feedback cycle. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jim. Assessor Y, anything you'd like to add before we depart?
Yeah, I really like Jim Lord's statement there about it being a writing cycle. I think just due to human nature, we often leave all of our writing to the very end of a unit. And, we're near the end of this one, but just as a heads up for our next ones, if you're writing as we go, you're taking on board that feedback, you're improving, you're reflecting, that cycle is possible. So definitely ask any questions you've got of your teacher, and just keep in mind it is a cycle. So if you haven't really started writing yet, there's still some time, but that time is narrowing. So get some stuff in so you can get that cycle going.
Thank you so much, Assessor Y, and we'll leave with some words of wisdom from Assessor X.
So obviously I agree with all of that. Fantastic advice. A couple of other things though. You can also practice the reading time, because we talked about that before. You can only get quicker if you practice. So practice that. Practice annotations. Practice annotations that work for you. That was mentioned earlier as well. I've got my own little kind of shorthand with it, which saves lots of time. So just find whatever works for you. Practice. I like the idea of the targeted practice as well. think about, particularly as we move into Unit 4 and towards the exams, not as the three different essays as three kind of distinct separate things. They're not. There's a lot of crossover between a text essay, an analysing argument essay, and a comparative essay. So even go back and look at your re-window feedback. A lot of that will still be applicable. If you need to work on your expression, if you need to work on your quoting conventions, it's still the same for this essay as well. Yeah, I think that's it. But definitely lean on your teachers.
Awesome. So to Jim Lord, to Assessor X, and to Assessor Y, thank you so much for spending the time and providing us with your exceptional insights. I've written down about, I think, 25 things that I'm going to think about. Really, really appreciate it. And best wishes for the rest of the week.